All right, so I've got my shadow basically laid in, and things are just about where I need them to be. So now I'm going to start rendering, and as I do this, I want to show really the way that I'm thinking when I render something. So let's just start with a sphere. I'm going to light it the same way that I've got the face lit. All right, so I know I've got my light coming from here, and I know also that my form that I'm dealing with is, it's kind of a rounded form. So what I want to do is just point my rendering out toward the light. And because I'm using a pencil here, I don't really have a thick to thin line that happens naturally. So I'm having to kind of scumble in a thicker line and then draw it out to a thinner line. But this is really exactly how I work when I use a real pencil. If I was just to pull the lines, you can see they get a lot less substantial looking. And it's very important. I have a pretty good idea of where I want to be in terms of my spacing, in terms of my line size, and it's important to me to make sure that they're all relatively a similar size and evenly spaced apart. And that really it comes naturally after practice. So that's basically it. So now I'm going to go into the face, and I've got a similar form here, and I'm just going to start rendering it. Generally speaking, the longer you're rendering, the more softly rounded your form is, and the shorter you're rendering, the more sharply you're turning. So if I had a form like this, and I went very sharp and quick with my rendering, it would give the idea of a very shallow bevel, something that's got more of a sharp corner. Whereas if I was to go and do something longer, you can see it really rounds out the form and softens it quite a bit as if it's more of a gradual plane shift. So I try to be aware of that whenever I'm rendering anything, and that's why it's important how long the rendering is. I just want to have the patience to keep everything nice and neat. And here, because I know this is the nose is fairly sharp, I want to keep those lines nice and short. If I go too long with them at all, it really disrupts the form and starts to look wrong. And really, as a bare minimum, that really covers all the rendering that I would absolutely need to do. The rest starts to just bring in some nuance and really some detail, which I really enjoy. And what's always most important is that you're really following the form with your rendering. And I had a choice. I could do something more like this, or round along the form like this. And I find for a lot of smaller forms, if I want to just soften the edge coming out of a form, I'll follow the form rather than go crossways. And if I have a larger form and I'm softening it towards the light, I'll go in the opposite direction of the flow of the form, and that kind of defines the lighting. So here's and this is a bit of a bigger, broader, softer form, so going a little longer. And as I get to the top, I'm gonna kind of lighten my lines, maybe even make them spaced a little bit further apart, and you can see how that kind of softens it as if it goes to a flat shape that just blends as it goes to the top. And again here, what I want to do is just kind of blend out that rendering as opposed to having something where I've got rendering, rendering, and it's coming up. It's nicer to have that little bit of a transition. So it just comes up hard, and then I just soften it out. A little thinner, a little more spaced out, and it can give you a nice effect. Okay, so now that I've got my main forms rendered in, I'm going to go in and just start to define some of my other planes and just give a little bit more detail to my rendering. So in order to do this, and there are a lot of ways to approach this, but what I like to do, and I think what you need to do, is really take a look at what your underlying forms are. And so for my cheek, I've got a form like this. I've also got a shape that comes from the eye down, out, and through like this. I've got a form that comes around through here like this. And these are the planes that I'm aware of. Here's another one here. It kind of comes like this. And those are the planes that I'm aware of while I'm rendering. And it makes it actually fairly simple to make rendering decisions as long as you're aware of those underlying shapes. So let me get rid of those lines, and now I'm just going to use that to find some of my eye socket there. And I'm going to take some of those lines and bring them down along that form that I was defining earlier. And now I'm going to run along the shape of the cheek here. And I'm keeping it fairly light because this whole area is really more in the light. And if I go too dark, too heavy with the rendering and the lines that I have here, it can start to visually conflict with my shadowed areas. And it's very important that I make sure that this whole area appears to be in the light. And here's a real example. These lines here are directly where my light is coming. And I'm really probably a mistake for me to put those in, but I find that those lines right there really kind of define the form. So be very aware if you're putting rendering where your actual light source is, that it's not having the effect of destroying your illusion. So now I'm going to come in here and continue to define this edge. Just enough to kind of get that form in there, but not so much that it starts to overwhelm your picture. I'm going to define this line right through here. So, and as you can see with my rendering, I'm just going to follow that line. And I do have a couple of choices, so I'll show you both. And also, notice how I'm breaking up my line and I'm not necessarily drawing full lines all the way through. Just giving that little bit of air in your line, breaking it up, can really add a little bit of bounce and life to your picture. And I'm creating a bit of a ridge along the lip there because that's a bit of a hard line, and then there's a bit of an indent if you look at your lip just above that. So that gives the illusion of that, just starting my rendering just above that. And now, because I've got a line that comes along through here, what I can do is come crossways to that, up toward the lighting, and do something like this, and this will work. And I really want to be aware of the direction of my other rendering, so and now, because I've got rendering coming this way, I can actually go crossways to this and mirror it down here. And you can see how I can actually kind of join back up into that patch of rendering up there. And it gives it a flow. And I've got I've got this rendering coming down this way and this rendering coming up this way. So I can bring this and just keep going along with the angle that I had defined before and give that just a little bit more. And now what I'd like to do is define the nose just a little bit. And you can see I've actually got a bit of a line here. So really what I'm dealing with is the shape of the nose is something like this. So I'm going to define that. Just like that. And to me that's looking like just a little bit much, so I'm going to just pull back on that a little bit. And from here really it just becomes a matter of looking at all your rendering and just making sure it looks fairly balanced on your picture. And the major job is finished. What I wanted to do here on the neck is just give this a little bit more weight and a little bit more depth. So I just followed my form as opposed to going crossways to my form. I just followed it along, and I could do the same thing here. And it's really, I could do the same thing here too, actually. There's really the way that I render. There's one of two ways to render along a form. There's either, and here would be my form. Here's my shadow. I can either render crossways, or I can render along the form. And either one works, really. So it's kind of an aesthetic choice, and I think you'll find as you go along, really the best way that I know of to learn how to do this kind of thing is to copy it from other artists and then apply it to your own work, and you'll find your own aesthetic will take over. You'll look at artists that do it in different ways and find ways that work for you. That's really how it worked for me. I love Dale Keown, Travis Charest, Mark Silvestri, and a lot of those sorts of artists really played into the way that I approach rendering, just from observing their work and from picking up on it while I was working. Something that I could do here, I'm going to do it just to show you, and then I'm going to erase it because it never seems to work. And this is where rendering anything it has to be a bit of an experience thing, and there's really no clear-cut formula. I'm going to render along the form underneath his eye, just this kind of a pattern here up towards the light. And I've done this sometimes, but for the most part, I find it just looks a little overbearing. It just reads like too much. And you can see how you can do that, but it starts to. I really don't know why that doesn't work, but it never works. And no matter how much you learn from a video like this, there's a certain amount of your own experience that has to come into play because things like that will happen. And the only way to know that certain sorts of rendering don't work for you is to try it and decide what works and what doesn't. All right, well, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.